Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. We know this is a very busy week in the climate calendar, and we appreciate you coming to the Climate Action Trackers event on net zero targets. My name is Claire Stockwell. I'm a senior climate policy analyst with Climate Analytics, and I will be your moderator for today's event. I have here with me from the climate analytics side, our CEO, Bill Hare, and Aman Majid, who leads the net zero analysis on our side. On the new climate side, I'm joined by Hanna Fekete, who is a longstanding member of the Climate Action Tracker, and Frederic Hans, who leads the net zero analysis on their side of things. We aim today to keep the presentations to around 30 minutes. Bill is going to kick us off and walk you through the state of climate action, followed by Aman, who will do the same with respect to the state of net zero targets. Frederic is then going to walk you through what makes a good net zero target design, as well as how countries are stacking up. And then Hanna will walk you through what needs to happen before COP27. And finally, both Hanna and Bill are going to make some final remarks about corporate net zero targets. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A, but though feel free to submit your question throughout the session. There's no need to wait until the Q&A starts. When you do so, if you could include your name and organization, that would be greatly appreciated. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time that we have available. But before I hand things over to Bill, just one final remark. Who you are seeing today is a small fraction of the Climate Action Tracker team. So we also have with us Sarah Heck, Mia Moisio, and Nico Fuchs, who are working behind the scenes to make sure this event is a success. And many of our country experts contributed to the presentation that you're about to see. So with that, I hand things over to Bill.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Climate Action Tracker update from the New York Climate Week. Can I get this next slide, please, Hanna? As everyone knows, we're in the process of trying to increase ambition on climate action globally. This is really becoming a very high-profile issue. At present, countries that have committed to targets under the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contributions, have in general not submitted targets that are actually strong enough. The updated NDCs at present represent the vast majority of global emissions and populations, but by and large, those NDC targets, the 2030 targets, don't match where we need to get to. The next slide, please. The overall headline findings from the Climate Action Tracker, pretty much that at present, current policies and actions are heading the world towards 2.7 degrees. This is the analysis that we did towards the end of the Glasgow year in November 2021. And we will be updating this for the upcoming COP in Egypt. But it's not a very good picture that we're heading for 2.7 degrees of warming. The 2030 targets on the table would reduce that if fully implemented to 2.4. And if we take a relatively optimistic view of the other targets on the table, including beyond 2030, long-term targets would be 2.1, and an extremely optimistic scenario if all of the net zero pledges on the table were actually implemented, then we would get down to around 1.8 degrees. But this, it has to be emphasized, is an extremely optimistic interpretation of where policy stands at present. The bottom line is that policy implementation is too slow at present, and we urgently need to close the emissions gap. The next slide, please, Hanna, I think shows where we stand on the emissions gap, or where we stood effectively at the end of Glasgow last year, taking into account the nationally determined contributions, NDC updates, by that time, and as well the sectoral impacts that were sectoral measures that were put forward and agreed in Glasgow, including methane, coal, electric vehicles, forestry. The NDCs closed, the updated NDCs closed the gap a little bit, 15 to 17%. The sectoral initiatives went a bit further. But what we need to see in Glasgow this year, and in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt this year, is an update of where these sectoral initiatives have got to. But as you can see from this figure on the right-hand side, there is a massive emissions gap remaining. And the IPCC assessment has been very clear that we do need to get down and close that gap if we're to have much of a chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So despite all the turmoil of this year, we see the focus needs to remain on getting emissions down. The next slide, please, Hanna. The bottom line is that there has been really little progress since COP26. Politics and geopolitics this year has been dominated by the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's sent energy markets into turmoil. But still, we feel countries should be moving ahead, and we don't see enough progress in putting forward more ambitious targets. So this is really a big concern, and one of the issues we'll get to when we turn to the outlook for COP27. Next slide, please. The US, it has made progress this year with its IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. It's still rated as insufficient, but it's heading in the right direction. Certainly a better situation in terms of domestic policies and implementation than we saw last year. And we would hope that there would be more measures coming from the US. The next slide, please, Hanna. Overall, the IRA Act is the most ambitious climate policy initiatives the US has ever taken. Over the years, there's been a lot of talk by different administrations, but for different reasons, unable to actually do much. But the Biden administration has got this act through, and it's taking measures to step forward. We've done analyses, groups like the Rhodium Group have done analyses, and they show that essentially emissions in the US will start to turn down under this act for the first time, really in a substantive way. And we know that the legislation has more measures embedded in it that we would hope the Biden administration really needs to roll out in order to keep the US emissions going down faster. So next slide, please. And I think we're handing over to Aman to do the state of net zero targets. Over to you, Aman.
Many thanks, Bill. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Aman Majid, and today I'll take you through the CAT's overview of net zero targets around the world. And specifically, we're going to explore countries' net zero targets and how the CAT rates them in terms of their design quality. So since the CAT started monitoring countries' progress towards the Paris Agreement, what we've seen is that the number of net zero targets has been increasing. So our latest estimates show that about 19 countries have net zero targets now enshrined into their laws. So examples of places where this is happening is the EU27 region, Japan, UK, New Zealand. The CAT views this as an important indicator, as the adoption of net zero as a legal requirement is a good safeguard that countries will work towards their net zero goal in the medium to long term. 53 countries have net zero targets either in a policy document or pledged. So for example, through a parliamentary decision, and places where this is happening includes the USA, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and India. 67 countries have net zero targets currently under discussion. So places like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And finally, 57 countries do not have a net zero target currently. So this includes Mexico, Iran, and the upcoming COP presidency, Egypt. Next slide, please. And those net zero targets that are currently either in law or part of an initiative or under discussion are also nearing global coverage of emissions. So around 88% of emissions are covered by these net zero targets. That means those countries without net zero targets currently account for about 12% of global emissions. It's a fairly significant portion of that pool of emissions, and we could well see that getting narrower if more and more countries adopt net zero targets. Next slide, please. And while it's positive that the number of targets is growing and the pool of emissions that's covered is growing as well. The devil, as always, is in the details. So the CAT has rated a number of countries in terms of their net zero quality, target quality. And we see that the vast majority of them are inadequate. And what we mean by adequacy and quality, we'll get into in a second. My colleague Frederic will really delve into the details on that. But for now, let's focus on the big picture. So here we see that that green segment represents the countries with what we rate as an acceptable net zero targets. And that's only 8% of countries, such as Chile, Colombia, the EU region, and the UK, whereas 74% of countries have an inadequate net zero target currently. And the crucial thing here is that many of the G7 and G20 countries fall into this bracket. So for example, Canada, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, China, etc., they all fall into this bracket and have a net zero target that we rate as either average or poor. And around 21% of the countries that we analyze, such as Brazil, India, and Egypt, either have an incomplete net zero target so that we couldn't complete the assessment, or they don't have a target at all. And that currently represents a key source of uncertainty about meeting net zero in these regions. Next slide, please. So what does that actually tell us about net zero targets and current actions in relation to the Paris Agreement? Well, the first thing is that as I said before, the number of targets is increasing, but we rate only 6 countries so far as having an acceptable target, which essentially highlights that we are far away from getting these targets implemented and resulting in a real-term emissions reduction. And as Bill highlighted, that current policies and actions are taking us towards a 2.7 degree world, far short of what's needed for the Paris Agreement. And that highlights that we need an increase in real world action, particularly in the short term to 2030. Next slide, please. And finally, this very, very optimistic scenario that Bill highlighted again, that all NDCs, net zero goals and policies being fully implemented, even those when taken together and perhaps given the benefit of the doubt, even they fall short of the Paris Agreement. And that shows that we need an increase in ambition on net zero targets and beyond. Now, we've talked a lot about net zero quality, design, etc. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Frederic, who will really delve into those details. So over to you, Frederic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aman. And indeed, like the next minutes, we would quickly like to introduce you what our methodology looks like that we apply to indeed to come to these sort of conclusions when we speak about how comprehensive are these targets and what should they actually do, governments should do in order to sort of come up with a good net zero target. So if we go to the next slide, really important to sort of emphasize here is that when we look at these net zero targets, we look at them from basically 3 different angles. One is, what is their scope? So what do they cover in terms of emissions? And what is their architecture? How are these targets basically structured? Are they, for instance, legally enshrined in law? And how transparent are they? So how good can we also as independent analysts understand, for instance, what are the underlying assumptions on carbon dioxide removals? And what we've done, and if you go to the next slide, Hanna, we have identified 10 key elements that we consider crucial to cover when communicating and committing to a net zero target. And governments can really use that as a blueprint to inform their decision-making processes, how these targets should look like. We will go into 3 of those. We unfortunately don't have time to go through all of them, but we will look into the question of emissions coverage, a review process, and comprehensive planning in more detail in a second. Perhaps just very important to stress here at this stage already is that what we currently do as the Climate Action Tracker when it comes to net zero targets, we assess their comprehensiveness. However, we do not assess their sort of sufficiency or Paris Agreement compatibility. So we at the moment do not have a method in place to say, are these Paris Agreement aligned, these net zero targets, which is obviously also a very important question, but we focus in the sort of first step that we currently undertake to really look at the comprehensiveness of these targets. So at the next slide, Hanna, we can here dive in a little bit into the sort of emissions coverage aspect. So what we define as sort of good practice is that these targets would really cover all greenhouse gas emissions and all economic sectors and are very transparent about it. And we see that already 15 out of the 41 cut countries are being evaluated acceptable in exactly doing this. So for instance, the US or Chile or the United Kingdom. But we also see that many countries, 8 of 41, do exclude either key parts or key emission sources, like for instance, New Zealand does with certain sector emissions, or for instance, China or Saudi Arabia only focusing on CO2 emissions, but not covering non-CO2 emissions. And oftentimes it's also very vague and very unclear what these targets cover. And that is obviously a challenge then to really understand what is the scope of these existing targets. Important to flag, there are a few countries, for instance, like Brazil and India here on the bottom, that we cannot evaluate currently because those have only been sort of early announcements, and there's no further detail yet provided. So basically, those targets we can then only look at once more information becomes available. If we go to the next slide, that's the second aspect we would quickly like to look into. It's the review process under architecture. So do countries establish legally binding review processes that both review the existing target according to latest available scientific information and also measuring and tracking progress towards meeting that target? And also, is that entire endeavor then legally enshrined? And also, again, here we see several countries who do indeed this, and also fairly successful, meaning that over time already we have seen that they have reviewed their target, they have strengthened them, they have perhaps added additional aspects. But then also we see that many countries here, and this is the medium yellow rating, have review processes in place, but they either are not legally binding, or they are then, for instance, not specific in terms of when is this review being carried out. So is that sort of done periodically, every 2 years, every 3 years? And that is then oftentimes sort of left unspecified, and thus then also perhaps create more uncertainty what the future process will look like. We also see that a few countries do not have any review established at the moment for their net zero targets. And that is something that we consider sort of poor or bad practice, simply given that this also then prevents governments from sort of periodically really reviewing what technological breakthroughs and what latest science says, and how that could be reflected with their targets. Going to the next slide, that would be the third element we would like to focus on. That is the comprehensive planning aspect under transparency, and obviously the planning underpinning net zero targets to really transparently lay out how a given government and country wants to achieve the target is tremendously important. And what we look at here when evaluating that under the current net zero targets being announced by governments, we look at, do governments provide specific pathway analysis and identification of key measures for reaching the target? Do they have credible sector-specific targets and policies in place? Do they communicate actionable short and medium-term measures? And again, also there we see that countries like Costa Rica or Colombia or the EU do exactly that. And then we see other countries that basically stop halfway. They have that to a certain degree, communicate perhaps pathways or so on, but lack more detail. That would be, for instance, Germany or New Zealand or China, for instance, in the case of Germany also, where they revised their target and brought it forward to 2045, but then they do not sort of update their planning accordingly, or that is sort of in the process, but we can't assess where that stands. And then also we have sort of the kind of bad practice of some countries like Australia or Saudi Arabia, where it's basically not clear how they intend to really achieve that target, and something that we then evaluate as bad practice. So that was looking at these 3 elements, basically an idea to give you a bit of a taste and an idea of how we go about this evaluation of comprehensiveness. Of course, you find more information on all other 7 elements than also in our methodology. And if you go to the next slide, Hanna, we we are basically enabled through applying that methodologies to really compare countries and to really understand, and that refers to what Aman presented before, to really understand then globally what does that mean, right? And what implication these existing net zero targets have. And we see that acceptable targets at the moment really do consider like all emissions within a country's jurisdiction, make very transparent assumptions on carbon dioxide removals, offsets, prioritize reduction within their own borders, not relying on offsetting, and enshrine these net zero targets in legal process, while poor targets remain very clear, very unclear and very vague. Oftentimes they lack robust planning, and they either do not provide any assumptions on carbon dioxide removals or offsets, or then are very sort of heavily relying on those, which then also needs to be questioned. So this is really the idea of that methodology that we published last year, and sort of since then have been applying and sort of using for our country-specific analyses to shed light on it. And if you go to our climate action tracker website, particularly the net zero target landing page, you can see all this detail for each single country, and you can also compare countries to each other, and that stays available. If you go to the next slide, Hanna, perhaps one remark, and we will elaborate a little bit more on that. No, one slide back, Hanna, thanks, just for 1 second. We in the Climate Action Tracker, we really focus on governments and national level targets, but very often we immediately receive the question how this looks at the corporate side, because also we see this sort of momentum in corporate net zero target setting, and this is something also where we see that these targets are often poorly designed and rely heavily on offsets, and we will discuss that in a minute with Hanna and Bill coming on this as well. And with that, over to you, Hanna.
Thank you very much. So the analysis that we've done largely shows that the net zero targets up to date are insufficient in their design, and they are not robust. So our optimistic scenario that you can see here, 1.8, that would even go much beyond 1.5, so it's not sufficient, but even that is quite unlikely if you consider the poor design of the net zero targets. So this is clearly one thing that has to improve. Countries have to be better, have to be building more robust net zero targets in the long term. We also see a huge mismatch, however, in short-term action. So if you look at the emissions gap and at what would happen until 2030, you can see this would take us to 2.7 degrees Celsius with policies implemented, and at best to 2.4 with 2030 targets, so NDCs implemented. So there is a huge mismatch between commitments up till 2030 and net zero targets, and that makes the net zero targets very incredible. The closing in the 2030 emissions gap is thus extremely important, and that's for ambition, so proper target setting targets for 2030 that are in line with long-term decarbonization, but then also actually achieving those targets, so real implementation on the ground. Countries have to take action and have to take responsibilities for their emissions. In Glasgow, we've seen many sectoral initiatives coming up, and countries now need to consider them in the national target setting. We can see that those sectoral initiatives do have an additional impact, which is great, but countries actually have to take this on board, increase their targets, their NDC targets for 2030, and then also ensure implementation of these sectoral initiatives. They should be held to account for those initiatives, and they have to report on progress. Otherwise, we risk that those sector initiatives just become a greenwashing exercise. And that takes me to the last bigger chunk of content that we want to cover today, and that is corporate net zero targets. So when we talk about countries and net zero, this largely stems from the global need to decarbonize as much as possible, but there will be some residual emissions from hard-to-abate sectors, for example, from agriculture because of food production. So there has to be a negative emissions element that overall then gets us into net zero emissions first, and then actually into net negative emissions in the second half of the century. This is super essential also as a concept for countries. And now we have seen many corporate net zero targets. And what is this about? So corporates set net zero targets for different years, and we've taken a bit of a closer look at those targets. However, those corporate net zero targets cannot be relied on, and governments should not count on corporates solving this. So of the 25 largest companies, roughly covering 3 gigatons of CO2 emissions in 2019, we found that only half a gigaton of those is actually committed emission reductions. A large chunk of the rest is emissions in scope 3, so basically emissions in the value chains of those companies that they're simply not covering, that they're not counting, or that they're offsetting, so that they're saying, okay, well, we don't need to worry about this so much, we just pay for somebody else to reduce emissions, sometimes with questionable calculation methods also. And then there's a chunk under targets that just really can't be judged, where the targets are calculated, formulated in an ambiguous way, so that we don't really know what exactly is going to happen there. That's also a very big chunk. So only a really small part of the corporate targets that we've looked at actually do reduce physical emissions globally. And this means then, in turn, again, governments cannot count on this to do the trick. Countries have to set their own targets, have to take this into account, yes, and have to ensure that they reflect the ambition of non-state actors in their country, but at the same time, they shouldn't count this as a driver of emissions. And there's another problem with this, and that's the scale of greenwashing that we are seeing here. We can see that 702 of the Forbes 2000 companies have set net zero targets this year, until this year, and that's a huge number of countries. However, only those only cover 40% on average of emission reductions across their whole value chain. So if you think of these huge companies, I mean, 60% of the emissions is left and is not covered by a net zero target, although it's labeled as such. And a large percentage of these reductions actually relies on nature-based offsetting. And this has huge risks in terms of environmental problems, but also permanence of these solutions, additionality, and so on. So what we're seeing here with the corporate net zero targets is really a huge, at huge scale. And the purpose for companies to become net zero is really questionable. For countries, it makes sense. You take it from the global need to decarbonize and compensate for some residual emissions in some sectors. But for corporates, they should really aim at reducing as much as they can. And there will always be residual emissions. The net zero targets hide those emissions, and the companies sell themselves as climate neutral, while actually they're just pushing the problem to elsewhere. And with that, over to Bill.
Thank you, Hanna. Yeah, look, just to reinforce the whole point that Hanna's made about the situation with corporate greenwashing. The United Nations Secretary General has been raising serious concerns about this now for some time, and his speech to the General Assembly yesterday was very, very strong on this. And the scale of the risk coming from corporate greenwashing, where companies look and claim that they're getting to net zero when they're not, is really, really high, and poses indeed a threat to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, which the Secretary General himself was flagging yesterday. So that's one of the reasons that we're raising this now as an important context. On the one hand, it's been very positive that many companies are looking to set net zero goals. But on the other hand, what we are seeing is a lack of real regulation and control of integrity in this area, and that, as Hanna's pointed out, most of the corporate net zero targets set don't actually reduce emissions. They simply adopt accounting measures and so on. So I think that's something that I think the whole policy community needs to look at. But I think now we'd like to hand back to Claire to to really facilitate the answering of all the very good questions that have come through.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks to all of the presenters for that fascinating presentation. And thanks to you all for submitting your questions. There's been we have a very long list already. So as I said at the top, we will do our very best to get through them, as many of them we can in the time that remains. I think I would start with the ones that are specifically around the net zero analysis, and maybe if I can I'll try and group them together a little bit, and if I could throw the first two to you, Aman. We've had a number of questions related to how the CAT determines what is an acceptable net zero target. So maybe if you could just walk us through the process for that decision making and how many the global coverage of emissions that falls into that at the moment. And then the second question, there's been a number relating to gas coverage, and how do you define, say, net zero versus carbon neutrality? So if you could walk through the meaning behind those terms and maybe specifically focus also on the question of methane gas and how does that fit in to that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Claire. Could you go to slide 21, please? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so just taking that question on how we judge or derive the acceptable rating. So Frederic took you through just 3 of these 10 key elements that are in front of us here. So in the scope category, we've got 4 key elements. So for example, emissions coverage, target year, international aviation and shipping, etc. And our country leads will go through each one of these 10 key elements in detail. And essentially within each one of those elements, there are subcategories. So that traffic light system that Frederic showed before, the sort of red, amber, and green, we rate within each one of these elements according to that system. And then overall, in aggregate, we take up all of those scores and add them up and derive the acceptable rating. So when we look at the sort of summary that Frederic has on slide 25, please, we see that countries that have got this acceptable rating, so there's the UK, Chile, Costa Rica, and the EU27 as a block, they all have some commonalities. So firstly, they consider all greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide. They make very transparent assumptions around their use of CDR and offsets. They're prioritizing reductions within their borders and enshrining net zero status to net zero targets into their legal processes and so on. And that's how that acceptable rating is categorized. Those 6 of 42 countries make up around 8 to 9% of the global emissions share. And then the point around carbon neutrality and net zero essentially falls under this first bullet point here. So we see this a lot in our analysis as well, that carbon neutral is essentially referring just to carbon dioxide, whereas net zero captures all greenhouse gas emissions. So there's not just CO2, there's like methane and sulfur dioxide, etc. And that's I suppose the fundamental difference between the two. And that's as far as I'm aware, the only process where methane is also captured into the net zero analysis. That was another question that came up. I think I got the bulk of them there, Claire. Is that right?
Yes, great. Thank you, Aman. And maybe just further to elaborate on the methane point, outside of the net zero analysis, we do have, and on the CAT website, on our individual country pages, we've started to track country action in relation to the methane pledge that came out of Glasgow. We don't have all countries updated yet. We're still in the process of getting those prepared for the COP. But if you are interested in a broader methane discussion beyond just our net zero analysis, I would encourage you to look at the individual CAT country pages under the policies tab. But more questions on the net zero analysis, and Frederic, maybe I'll put you in the hot seat this time. We've got a bunch of questions related to nature-based solutions. So could you perhaps walk us through how nature-based solutions are sort of incorporated in the CAT net zero analysis, and maybe what would make a good inclusion of nature-based solutions?
Yeah, these are very relevant questions. So perhaps first, what is really important to stress is that what we assess is, or basically also the information we compile is, what do governments say about what will be their LULUCF sinks by the time they aim to reach net zero, right? Because sort of the netting that will happen through LULUCF sinks and other carbon dioxide removal technologies. And this is why we stress that aspect of transparency so much, because only if we have these assumptions available, we really understand what the government means, right? Because if that's not clear, what the assumptions are, it remains unclear also what the remaining residual emissions will be at the target year. So this is something where we put a lot of emphasis on, and most countries say something about it, but oftentimes these assumptions that governments take, they are simply not clear, and it's also not clear how do they derive those, how do they factor in terms of what their LULUCF sinks will be at the target year, how do they factor in climate change by their target year, do they have an uncertainty range, what are the scientific estimates, etc. So that's really something we also encourage to include. There's another aspect to it, and that would be sort of relying on offsets outside of their own borders that might be based on nature-based solutions. So far, we have not seen many countries in the context of the net zero targets explicitly say that. But that would be something that we would see very, very critical and clearly not advised. So our good practice sort of definition is to really reduce emissions within own borders and not to rely on offsets in other jurisdictions. And even if a country would do that, then we would require the country to really set really stringent limitations on how much of emissions that would cover. So those are a bit the two aspects there that are perhaps worth highlighting.
Great, thanks very much, Frederic. Maybe if we could then stand back for a second from the sort of specific net zero analysis. We also received a number of questions related to the CAT thermometer and our estimates around our optimistic pathway in the relation to 1.5 degrees. So perhaps just a reminder, the temperature estimates that we presented, or that Bill presented at the top, are from our analysis from Glasgow last year, and those are also the estimates that are currently available on the CAT website. We are in the process of updating that to incorporate the NDCs, the few NDCs that have come out this year so far, and we'll be releasing that, and we anticipate in the first week of the COP. I should say all CAT numbers are related to median estimates, so 50% probability of happening. But maybe if I can put Bill, give you the harder question and talk about the feasibility of the 1.5 limit and whether that's still realistic. Bill, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, look, the 1.5 degree feasibility, is it still possible, is the question everyone's asking. World is now close to 1.2 degrees warming. But the IPCC has shown very clearly that geophysically that's possible. It's shown that if we can get onto a 1.5 degree pathway, which means basically halving emissions by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050, then we will be able to successfully limit warming to about 1.5 degrees with about a 50% probability. So it's still possible, but the real challenge is to get the emissions down. That is, governments to really step up their action and so on. What the IPCC has shown is that it's economically possible, that it really comes down to a matter of political will to do that. So I think that's what everyone should bear in mind, that the 1.5 degree target is still within reach. And we know that every increment of warming above that rapidly escalates risk. So that I think that's something to really bear in mind, and that's why everyone's now talking about why the next decade is the most critical decade we'll ever have on climate change. We're not going to have another crack at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. This is really the last time that we'll really be able to achieve that.
Thanks, Bill. though not a heartwarming message, but I guess on the urgency of the next decade. Frederic, do you want to perhaps walk us through what are the sort of main issues in net zero target design and why it's really sort of critical that we get things right in the short amount of time that we have? And perhaps you could also touch on whether we also include a just transition in our analysis, or how we consider that as well.
Yeah, two very relevant points. So perhaps on the main aspects. So when we look at these 10 key elements that we have defined, obviously it's very tempting to ask which are the most important ones, right? What we should focus most on. And I think really the answer is they all need to be considered in a combination, right? Because if we, for instance, have cover all emissions, which is very good, right? All sectors, all gases, as Aman explained a minute ago. But for instance, we have completely unrealistic LULUCF sink assumptions, or those are not being made transparent, that really jeopardizes the target's ambition. So it's really, and that's a bit our understanding of that methodology also, to really, those 10 aspects, they need to sort of looked at and being interlinked. And when governments design those targets, all those aspects need to be considered. So there is no sort of perhaps hierarchy between those elements. That would be my take on that. The other question on the just transition aspect, that is, of course, a very, very relevant one, particularly the sort of domestic just transition, right? How when we sort of transition our economies towards net zero, this is not something that we currently cover under our methodology, simply for the reason that, not to sort of de-emphasize that issue, but simply that within the scope of the exercise that we undertake, also focusing sort of on the emissions impact, we sort of left that out, but that clearly does not mean that this is not relevant, and it is highly relevant, of course, and we see also that some countries already, when announcing these targets, etc., start thinking about it, but at the moment, at present, it's not covered in the methodology.
Great, thanks, Frederic. And Hanna, I would just not going to get away from putting you in the hot seat. So I was wondering if you could answer the next question for us. As Frederic said in his core presentation, the CAD analysis of net zero targets at the moment doesn't deal with alignment with Paris. Could you maybe walk us through the sort of reasons for that and what the ratings tell us? As well as we've had questions around how many years would a country need to be considered carbon neutral?
Yes, thank you. So the Climate Action Tracker, of course, has a long history in rating targets of governments, including the alignment with temperature goals. We do not do that for the net zero targets at the moment, but we do that for the NDCs. So we compare NDCs, so 2030 targets, against a fair share framework. So what would be an equitable contribution of a country? And we compare it to modeled domestic pathways, which are built on least cost scenarios, global least cost scenarios. And for those targets, we can say whether countries are aligned or not aligned for their 2030 targets. For 2050 or other long-term targets, it's a bit more complicated because we currently don't have a fair share method for the long term. When we look at global least cost pathways in the long run, or well, let's say global scenarios generally, we see that emissions have to halve by 2030 globally, and CO2 emissions have to be at zero or net zero by 2050, around 2050. That is on a global level, and there is currently no method that combines both a fair share perspective and a cost efficiency perspective for the long term. But this 2050 as a year for decarbonization globally, or for net CO2, that then lets us draw conclusions on the sector level as well. And CAT has other work where we look at the sector level and derive benchmarks from that, for example, for a coal phase out or a fossil gas phase out. So all of these things can be indications of the alignment of long-term targets as well, as long as the countries provide this level of detail.
Great, Thank you very much, Hannah. Now, both you and Bill at the end of your presentations talked a little bit about the corporate targets. So I was wondering if, Bill, you wanted to come in and say, and Hannah, feel free to add here as well, if we have any plans to look at the net zero targets in relation to major global companies, and then perhaps also comment more generally about what role we think that either philanthropies or business leaders could play in achieving net zero targets.
Yeah, look, good questions. I think on the corporate, large corporate net zero targets and assessing those, that's something the Climate Action Tracker would like to get into. I mean, there are relatively few number of corporations which, if looked at globally, would capture the majority of global emissions. So it is something that's becoming increasingly policy relevant, and we're also unfortunately seeing a number of countries pointing to corporate action as an alternative to their own action. I think that's something that Hanna really emphasized in her interventions earlier, that this is inappropriate. But because of this emergence of corporate action and the concerns that have risen globally about that, it would be something that we would like to prioritize in the years ahead. And sorry, what was your next question, Claire?
It was related to the role that philanthropies or businesses could play.
Oh yeah, look, this is an interesting question, and it depends really where you're sitting. I mean, I got the question yesterday from, let's say, a shipping company. Well, if I had $1 billion to spend, where would I spend it? And if you're a shipping company, you can say, well, maybe look at your whole investing in transformational change in the whole aspect of your shipping operation. So if you're a philanthropy, for example, engaged in the Asian region in shipping, to take one example, then you would look at how to support movement to green net zero fuels for ships, such as green ammonia. And you're looking at not actually just investing in individual ships, but in investing in the industry making transformational changes. And I think philanthropies that can engage with government should also be looking at how to encourage, particularly in Asia, governments to get onto a fossil fuel phase-out trajectory to replace many of the extant plans for coal and gas in the region with accelerating renewables and efficiency, and how to capture the just transition benefits. In most cases, making the transition away from coal or gas will lead to increased employment outcomes and better economic outcomes. And I think in the Asian region, particularly, I think this needs to be a focus. And finally, in the Asian region, also the so-called hard-to-abate measures, industries which have been mentioned so far, as something that could really be focused on. So I've mentioned shipping, for example, but steel, chemicals, manufacturing that is energy intensive is also a very big source of emissions in the Asian region, something that philanthropies can invest in trying to trigger those transformational changes, and working together with steel mills and so on to actually engineer that as something that philanthropies could play a very big role in.
Thanks, Bill. I was wondering actually if I could stay with you for a second, because you started to talk there about the phase out, and we did get a number of questions on the relationship between oil and gas and the 1.5 degree pathway. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that and maybe touch a little bit also on offshore GHG emissions. Okay, well, look, I think as everyone is now aware, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has provoked a global energy crisis. And the overflow from that is that, from my perspective, we're seeing the oil and gas industry really taking advantage of that and promoting massive gas developments, particularly in Africa, Asia, Australia, which will render the Paris Agreement targets unachievable if implemented. So there's a massive problem emerging here. And I think that explains why the Secretary General was so hard and harsh in his words yesterday about this industry. It's very clear that
the energy crisis caused by the Russian invasion needs to be dealt with by the European Union. On the numbers of it, we don't believe that's going to significantly affect the European Union's ability to achieve its targets. Our assessment are that it will probably get below the 55% target, even despite the situation. We know about the extension of coal, for example, in Germany. That looks like it's very temporary and won't have a long-term implication for emissions. The real issue is coming actually from the European Union's green taxonomy, which is labeled gas as green, and that's being used at a rhetorical level around the world to justify gas as green. And that's one of the really, I would say, disastrous diplomatic overflow effects of the European Union's green taxonomy, which has been totally underestimated by the European Union. And in our work around the world, it's being used everywhere to say that gas is green. I was at a reception last night hearing leaders from the Latin American countries talking about how green gas was because the Europeans said it. I've heard that from Africans as well. So I think this is a really big mess, to be frank. And I think everyone needs to be aware that the alternatives to gas exist. They are cheaper and better and faster to roll out than gas in terms of overcoming energy poverty and helping sustainable development. So I'm just flagging this as something that everyone in the policy community needs to be paying a lot of attention to.
Great. Thanks, Bill. If we could maybe shift gears for a second, we have actually had a number of questions on our fair share methodology. And so I was wondering, Hanna, if I could get you to walk through, CAT's thinking around fair share and how do we incorporate that into our assessments.
Yeah, thank you. And just to stress again that this is not something that we're currently considering for the long-term targets, but really only for the 2030 targets. We have the goal to reflect the Paris Agreement's equity and common but differential responsibilities principle in our work. And to do so, we take a look at how the global effort that's required for keeping temperature increase below 1.5, how that could be shared between countries. And in research, there are many different approaches that calculate such shares using indicators like the historical emissions, for example, per capita emissions, but also GDP per capita, for example, to reflect the wealth of a country and so on. And based on many different approaches that exist, we derive a range where countries could be placed in and considered to be contributing at their fair share. And just really important that this, again, it's for the 2030 targets. We currently don't have a method for the long-term targets here.
Great. Thanks very much, Hanna. Well, we are getting close to the top of the hour, so I will unfortunately have to cut off the Q&As there. I did want to give the panelists 1 minute to just sort of summarize and leave us with some key thoughts from today's discussion. But before I hand it over to Bill, we did have some questions about how CAT interacts with governments, and I would say we are an independent group. We do obviously want governments to take our analysis into consideration, and we always welcome sort of feedback and engagement with governments, but we do provide that analysis out on our webpage, all of our individual country analysis to just to both hopefully inform governments' decision-making, but as well as a resource for all of stakeholders for your own engagements as well, and to hold countries accountable to the targets that they put on the table and track how well they're doing. So thank you all for your wonderful questions. And maybe if I can start off with Bill, if you'd like to give us some final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And I'm sorry that we can't answer all the questions in the time available, but there's some very valuable ones that we'll certainly take away and reflect upon in the CAT team, and feel free to ask them at our next webinar and we'll try and prioritize them. Look, I think one of the messages that you're taking away from the Climate Action Tracker team is that we're not in a good way. I think that there's no way to basically avoid that. There are positive developments going on. We've alluded to some of those. There are some countries updating NDCs, some moving forward with increased ambition, but the overall outlook for these for COP this year in Egypt is simply not good. And I think that's something that everyone needs to take away wherever they are and work on how they can improve the situation ahead of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, because we really need to see not a setback in Egypt, but at least a sense that we can move forward and close this massive emissions gap that we've got ahead of us. And it's just so strongly reinforced by the catastrophes we've seen in Pakistan this year and other places, that already the impacts of climate change are catastrophic in many regions and upon us, and show the urgency of why we need to halve emissions.
Aman?
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, if I may, I'd like to bring it back to the net zero topic that we focused on today. And the thing that I would like to focus on is our overall rating so far of these countries, particularly in developed countries. And simply put, all of these countries need to strengthen the quality of their net zero targets. And I should emphasize that includes those countries that we rate as acceptable as well. We're not saying they're perfect. So for example, you know, the EU, we rate as acceptable, but as Bill highlighted, the actions around the taxonomy, although not directly related to net zero targets, and particularly around the equity of the net zero target, could definitely be strengthened. Yeah, and I think the point around it is that these countries do have a major responsibility to lead decarbonization globally, but also have a position on the world stage to assist decarbonization across the world. So I think that would be my take home.
Thanks, Aman. Frederic?
Yeah, I think it very closely links to what Aman said. I think what is so important is indeed the independent scrutiny of targets that are currently sort of being proposed, right? We've seen that wave, that momentum, and governments and corporates, etc., and all announcing and pledging net zero, carbon neutrality, etc., and that scrutiny that we and also others sort of apply, that is so important to also first and foremost also really inform and foster peer learning, right? To really understand what is good practice and how can we improve our targets. And I think in that context, it is also so important that governments come to a more sort of harmonized common definition, as we, for instance, and again others also have proposed here, how a net zero target should look like, because only if net zero targets are well designed and they are transparent and it can really be understood what is meant by them, they are the sort of the really positive and beneficial guideposts where societies want to go, right? And if that is not being done, then we see this major risk that they're really used as a smokescreen to delay the super urgent short-term action, and that is really something that we need to avoid. So this is why we are also so engaged in that discussion and trying to provide that independent analysis and transparency on the status quo and how that can be improved.
And final word to you, Hanna.
Thank you. So what I find quite shocking is the extent to which many countries, but also corporates, of course, see net zero targets as a theoretic exercise that is something to tick off maybe for international processes, or even worse, for greenwashing. And what we would need to see is really countries and corporates thinking through what has to happen in terms of actual implementation, what has to happen in terms of transformation and sector transitions to make 1.5 a reality. And this requires some more drastic thinking. Bill talked about the need for phase out of fossils, and many of the net zero trajectories that countries are putting forward actually still include a high share of fossils. And then there's somewhere a sentence, yeah, sure, we'll cover this with carbon capture and storage, but it is not a credible approach. The cost of carbon capture and storage are increasingly high, feasibility still low, permanence is an issue. It's not going to work out if countries approach net zero in this way and leave alone corporates. So we really need to link this back to what has to happen on the ground and then actually do it. And each year we postpone this doing it and delay it while we're still talking about net zero just runs a huge risk for whole economies to then have to do very drastic changes, let alone climate change impacts. But even from the mitigation efforts that will be required later on, those will be largely disruptive. So it's super important that we get emissions down in this decade and really get this transition going. Any investments in fossils are no longer economically feasible if you look at it from a net zero perspective. And this is something that's a drastic change. We have not been on the right in the right direction in the last decade, and we need to change this. And all countries have to change this, and that stresses the importance of climate finance for developing countries as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Hanna, and to the rest of the speakers. And thank you to our audience for your attention. The slides from today's presentation, as well as the recording, will be up on our website shortly. So have a nice day, everyone.